Hello and welcome. So ChatGPT is quite cool and handy, but it's kind of annoying that we have to switch back and forth between Emacs and ChatGPT. So wouldn't it be much cooler if we could just use ChatGPT inside of Emacs? So let's just do it. So if you just want to use ChatGPT inside of Emacs, I created a package called Emacs Elaiza. You can install it by just pasting the package command inside of your Doom package.cl. And there you can not only use ChatGPT, but you can use different LLMs. So for example, Claude 3 or your local models provided by Llama Files or Ollama. And it's not just the chat interface, but you can also create your own GPTs. So for example, there is an enhanced Emacs Doctor or an Emacs editor that gives you suggestions for your text. A link to the Elaiza repository you can find in the description. Feel free to fork it or make a pull request. So what's ChatGPT anyway? Now, if we look at the web interface, you can see it's a chat interface between two participants. So us, the user on the one hand, and the LLM, the assistant on the other hand. And we start with a prompt, and then the assistant answers, and then we can continue the conversation. That is it. Behind the scenes, we're just talking to the chat completions API. Therefore, our plan is the following. So we need to start or send a prompt from inside Emacs to OpenAI via their API. Then we need to display the response. And then we need to keep track of who wrote what. So then we can display each participant and can act upon the answer of the assistant. So let's get started. If we look at the documentation and scroll down to the chat completions API, we see that the API is actually quite simple. It consists basically of three things. So one, we need an OpenAI API key. Then we need to specify which model we want to use. And then we need to provide all the messages that have been written so far. So ChatGPT is stateless. That means every request must have the complete history. So when we start the conversation, it's just our initial prompt. And then when we continue with the conversation, we have not only our message, but also the previous responses from the model. Creating an OpenAI API key is straightforward. So first you need to create a new project. And then you click on Dashboard, API keys, and then you can create a new API key and copy it. And now we can just paste it into our file and start coding. For the post request, we use URL retrieve. URL retrieve requires two parameters, one our API endpoint as URL, and then a callback function because it's an asynchronous function. Using let, we can then bind the request parameters around URL retrieve. We need to specify the request data, the request method, and the request extra headers. So request method would be a post request, extra headers would be what content type, and our API key, and the request data would be our model and the messages array. And before we make a complex function, let's just hard code the first message by us with the content hello. Now let's test it and see what the response of the model is. So if we switch to the hidden buffer where we can get the full response, you can see that first we get the header and then the body, and they are separated by two new line characters. So first we need to extract the body by searching for the two new line characters, and then to extract the content of the response, we need to traverse the JSON object. Now in this example here, we are not streaming the response, but getting the full response, which makes it a little bit easier to parse. In the Elaiza package, we use the streaming response, so you get the same effect as in the ChatGPT web interface, where you get word by word the response. And that also has the additional benefit that you can stop the response when you see that the answer is either already there or your prompt wasn't specific enough and you want to retry. So let's refactor the JSON parsing into a separate function and then run everything. To see the response, we can also create a new buffer. Let's call it ChatGPT. And there we can now insert the response that we have parsed with the previous function. So if we then want to continue the conversation with the model, we need to figure out how can we separate who wrote what. So the first part was by the user, then the assistant, and now we respond to the model. And because the API is stateless, we always need to send all the previous messages with it. So one way would be, of course, to just divide by those user and assistant markups. But a nicer way is to use so-called text properties. So for example, if we switch to org mode, you can see that the characters now have some text properties, and we can just add a new one. Let's call it ChatGPT role, and then we can write, is it from the user or from the assistant? And by default, we could say it's always from the user, and there we can use a hook, the after change functions hook. And this hook is always called when something in the buffer changes. So there we know, okay, new text has been inserted in the buffer, and let's give this specific text the new text property ChatGPT role user. And when we get the response from the model, we add the text property assistant. And because the add text property function overrides an existing property, we need to modify our hook so that it doesn't override the existing role. So now that we have a way to differentiate between user and assistant text, we just need to split by the ChatGPT role. And for that, we can just go to the bottom of the buffer and search backward for the ChatGPT role. Why backward? Because when we add those results to a list, we don't have to reverse it in the end. So now we can just say, okay, when we have a match, everything from the start of the match to the end is one message, and the text property is the role of the message. And if we do that from the bottom to the top, we have all our messages. Then we can just encode them as an array and create our new request. So finally, we just need to create a new ChatGPT continue conversation function that does splitting the text and then creating a new post request to the API and insert the response. And now we are able to chat with the model. Done. So if you have any ideas what GPTs we could write, or you have any suggestions how you could refactor the Emacs Lisp code, write it into the comments. So before we wrap up, there are still some minor details that we need to address. So first of all, by default, ChatGPT responds using Markdown syntax. So it makes sense to use Markdown syntax for indicating who wrote what. Then we need to encode our strings using UTF-8 so we don't get any encoding errors. And for convenience, we could create a ChatGPT mode. And when you call ChatGPT mode, you are prompted in the mini buffer to start the conversation. Now let's wrap up. So if we want to have our own ChatGPT inside of Emacs, we need to make post requests to the chat completions API. And there we start with a prompt and then get a response from the model. All are encoded as messages in an array. And we display everything inside our buffer. And using text properties, we can separate who wrote what. And then to continue the conversation, we need to split the buffer by this role and send everything encoded as a messages array to the API. If you like this video, please like and subscribe it. It matters a lot to me. So if you enjoyed this project and want to do it on your own, maybe you don't even use Emacs. Maybe you use Vim or VS Code or NeoVim. So code it by yourself. It's not hard, but I think it will give you a better understanding of your text editor. A link to the GitHub for this project is in the description. And again, if you just want to use it and want to use a more sophisticated package, there's also the link for Emacs Elaiza. Thank you for watching, and I see you in the next one.